But in the 1970s, evangelicals start seeing Israel as a moral and eschatological necessity. That eschatology is just a study of end times. So the eschaton is, or eschatology is, how the time period from now until we approach the coming of Christ. So that eschatology, that it's an end time. It's an increase of a scale, or almost like a ramp that you might say, that culminates in the coming of Christ, the second coming, and the establishment of, if you're premillennials, the establishment of the millennial kingdom, or if you believe that Christ is coming to establish a new heavens and new earth. Basically the end of time in that scenario. So you got key drivers in the 70s, Hal Lindsey, like I just mentioned. Jerry Falwell becomes key and significant, Pat Robertson, and then of course Billy Graham becomes more vocal. Now when I was growing up in the 80s, a television network known as CBN was on my TV all the time. And this was the Christian Broadcasting Network. And so my mom especially would listen to Pat Robertson, would listen to the 700 Club, would listen to all of these Bible teachers on there that were prophecy focused. A lot of them are prophecy focused. A lot of them are charismatic. They're believing that, they're praying with people on the TV who are at home and called in. They may have a live show, and they're like, yeah, go up and I'm paraphrasing, this may or may not have happened, but it's sort of like, yeah, go up and touch the screen, and we'll pray for you, pray for your healing. But it was prophecy centered, it was charismatic centered, and there was Israel focused as well. So you might have commercials where $1 a day might support an Israeli child for a whole month, things like this. CBN, big driver. But Hal Lindsey, like I mentioned earlier, in 1970 he publishes The Late Great Planet Earth. I have this book, and I've read it. I've read his other book too, Countdown to Armageddon. We'll mention that in a second as well. But he bases his book, his pro-Israel centered book, on the super sign of 1948. In other words, when Israel becomes a nation state in 1948 and is recognized as such by essentially the world, Hal Lindsey starts a prophetic clock from 1948 in order to sort of predict or prophesy about Christ's return, which he said would happen in 1988. Now, the theological justification for this would be based off of like a Matthew 24 type passage, and anything where you see like, this generation will not pass away until these things happen, or Christ, essentially inferring that Christ would return in a generation from when these signs or events would happen. So generation, roughly 40 years. Hal Lindsey starts the prophetic clock in 1948, which leads him to the 1988 return of Christ. And I think he either had a book or a paper that he published that said, was it 88 reasons? 88 reasons that Christ will return in 1988, something like that. A number of reasons that he would return in 1988. So this book that he wrote, The Late Great Planet Earth, it becomes the most influential book reshaping views on Israel in the 20th century. It was massive, like a huge bestseller. People at this time period were hungry for the pro-Israel stuff, because you're getting preachers from the dispensational background that are teaching this. You're getting TV shows and radio shows, Billy Graham's evangelistic crusades. Everything has a shift towards this pro-Israel. And the reason is because people were expecting that Christ was going to return. And they saw Israel as the sign of that. And so I remember as a kid growing up being afraid in my bed, like, that Jesus was going to come back and I was never going to get to live life. Now, is that weird? I don't know. Maybe we all had those feelings who grew up in Christianity as a kid, and you think, I'm not ready for Jesus to come back yet. I haven't experienced anything. I haven't lived yet. Which was kind of silly, right? Like, to be with Jesus is far better than anything here on earth. And as I've grown older, the more I've come to realize that, for sure. But these things happen. Like, I would lay in my bed being essentially crying that, man, they keep telling me that Jesus is going to come back any day now. Like, the prophetic fervor was constant, right? Constantly. And at the center of this was Israel. If you watch Israel on the news and they're attacking someone, we were always at the threat of World War III. One of Hal Lindsey's book, that Countdown to Armageddon that he writes, it was always trying to prophetically look at nations through the lens of the newspaper and say, if we're in this Cold War with Russia, and if we end up going to war, it's going to lead to World War III, it's going to pull Israel in, and then Jesus is going to return. This is what the environment was. Very, very volatile. So the book that he writes, it unifies evangelicals and launches the moral majority. It kicks us off. Geopolitics, they merge with Bible prophecy. That's exactly what I've just talking about. So what happens in the 70s is you've got this evangelical fervor and interest over Israel. You've got prophecies that are on the rise. And so in the geopolitical world, they start to take notice. One, because if you can rally the evangelical vote around your cause, you're going to win the election, right? Obviously. But two, you start to think, hey, wait a second, maybe there is something about this. Maybe we need to pay closer attention to the geopolitics of the Mideast, and maybe something is on the horizon, right? So the evangelicals start to get their identity based on Israel. It brings Bible prophecy into pop culture with this book that he wrote. It does. You may still be able to find this, but for a while, you could find Hal Lindsey's book in like a Kmart. I know those are out of business, but a Kmart or a Walmart now. You could find them in that little section that they usually have on Bible or religious books. Just a little small pop culture section that they've always had. All of these large stores have had over the years, but the late great planet Earth was always in there. Hal Lindsey, massive pop culture presence because of this book. And you start to see a rise in dispensationalists becoming newspaper exegetes. Now, I already referenced that earlier, but it's just a long-standing view that would say because of dispensationalism, you constantly pay attention to the signs of the times, right? Like you're constantly watching the news to see what's taking place in the Middle East. When is this World War III? By the way, I don't know. I should have looked this up, but I do not know who started this thought process that World War III was somehow going to bring it into the world. I just don't know. I don't know where this came from. I don't know why we do this, but it's essentially mental torture because growing up, I was always led to believe that this World War III was going to be catastrophic and cause Christ to return. So, moving on from there, we've got 1973, and that's a Yom Kippur War. Israel manages to make it out of there, but also think about this. So if you've got a number of wars that are taking place, and your prophecy is dependent upon Israel and what happens there, and you're kind of viewing it things like, well, if a war breaks out and World War III breaks out, this is going to lead to Armageddon, and Armageddon is when Christ is going to return. And Christ is going to come and basically create peace in this wartime situation. You can just see how all this would start to snowball. I mean, you have another war, and you're watching the news like, oh, here they go again, right? Like it's obvious. So that 1973 dispensational Armageddon era sermons explode, right? This is going to feed the fervor, which, by the way, reminds me of the event that essentially lays the groundwork for dispensationalism, and that was the French Revolution. Same thing happened then in the French Revolution. You got the Napoleon rise, and people are seeing the rise of Napoleon as the rise of Antichrist. And so this creates prophetic fervor during that time period as well. Massive. There were prophetic conferences just sprouting up everywhere, and it was into that environment that a man by the name of Edward Irving rises with prophet. He was an understudy of Thomas Chalmers, a great man, a great Scottish man, and Irving started going off the rails, and Chalmers was like, I can't do this anymore. Like, you're out of here. You're done. And to have a man like Chalmers that would set you aside, I feel like that should have been eye-opening for him, but it wasn't. He's a very prideful man, and he starts participating in these prophecy conferences. And so this imminent return of Christ begins to develop very quickly. And then you start to see some issues related to Israel pull in. So that's really a mirror image. Those late 1700s, early 1800s is really a mirror image of what was happening in the 1970s. Everybody is always concerned about prophecy.